Hello again. One of the things I cannot help but notice about many people who regard themselves and describe themselves as anti-racist is that their language often tends to be more than a little personal and inflammatory. I think we've seen examples of that in the comments made on these videos. It's done whenever they encounter anybody who holds a view which they personally regard as unacceptable. Sometimes this is no more than a way of showing themselves to be good people. They demonstrate that they feel such horror and repugnance for racism that they can't help but be unpleasant and rude to the person who they're accusing of being racist. At other times, it's used as a way of disguising a weak argument, particularly if there's a discussion about the possibility of inherited characteristics of this or that ethnic group. I mentioned before Adam Rutherford's new book, How to Argue with a Racist, which we see here. This provides us with a wonderfully clear illustration of exactly how this misdirection happens. When he writes about the views of anybody he disagrees with, Rutherford, who is, by the way, a geneticist, really ought to know better, he's a scientist, you might expect him to be a little more objective. Whenever he comes across someone he disagrees with, he slings mud about. Here he is about a psychologist whose views he does not like. It should in principle be possible to consider Lynn's work independently of his racist and white supremacist views. Well, of course, it should not only be possible, it's essential. If I'm reading what some astronomer has spotted on Mars, there's absolutely no point me worrying what his political views are. I'm more concerned with the strength of his data. He helpfully goes on also to tell us that this particular psychologist has attended what he describes as far-right conferences. This is all really weird because in ordinary academic discourse, the political leanings of chemists and physicists and biologists have little bearing on whatever theories they espouse or the experiments that they conduct. Certainly it's not a matter of common observation, at least. It would be surprising to read of work with a polymerase chain reaction if somebody wrote of it, Professor Brown, who is politically on the far right, or an astronomical measurement made by Dr. Brown, who is of course a member of the Communist Party. These hypothetical cases sound grotesque, and yet whenever a scientist deviates from what is thought to be acceptable, the correct view as far as race and ethnicity goes, at once every aspect of their private life, their political allegiance and so on, is regarded as fair game. Because of this, it suggests to me that debates about perhaps IQ levels in different parts of the world, that the disagreements are ideological and political rather than merely scientific. Rutherford's not the only one, he's a chief offender, but he's not the only person that carries on like this. Here's Steve Jones. He's formerly, where's his book? Here it is. Steve Jones was The Language of Genes. He was formerly Professor of Genetics and head of the Galton Laboratory at University College London. That book won the Roane Pellenc Prize for the Best Science Book of 1994. He says in it, much of the work on inherited differences in intellect between races is contemptible. I mean, you can hardly imagine a professor writing, much of the work on quantum mechanics is contemptible. At the very least, this might be expected to raise eyebrows because we don't normally use the word contemptible in connection with scientific research. Returning now to Rutherford's book about racism, I was slightly staggered to read on page 185 this paragraph. It behoves us all to confront racism wherever we find it, especially when it is covert or normalised in stereotypes and myth, and science is a weapon in that contest. The academic and political activist Angela Davis says that in a racist society, it is not enough to be non-racist, we must be anti-racist. I'll leave aside the question of using the word behove. People have commented quite harshly here about my supposed pomposity, but nobody's ever caught me saying that it behoves us. This really is the most frightful hypocrisy on the author's part. Mentioning Richard Lynn's political views wasn't just some personal idiosyncrasy of Rutherford's, it's par for the course when progressive people are discussing racism. They always emphasise the political views or disgraceful private life of those who hold different views to their own on the matter. They never do this, however, with the people they quote approvingly. Let's see if Angela Davis, who is, by the way, has reinvented herself in recent years as a philosopher, let's see if she's somebody whose views we should be eager to treat with respect and consideration. We might begin by mentioning that for over 50 years now she's been a member of the Communist Party. We might also remember that she bought, when she was a member of the Black Panthers, she bought 2 guns, a shotgun and a pistol, and both were subsequently used in a murder during a breakout from a courtroom where the brother of a man she was having an affair with was on trial. It ended with the judge being shot dead. Angela Davis was tried for murder and acquitted, and she was very lucky to get off, I'm bound to say. Afterwards, she said that she wanted to fight for all political prisoners, and now she says that she'd like to see all prisons closed and nobody kept in prison at all, except for Jews apparently. When she was visiting the Soviet Union, because the communists were very keen on her, this was when Brezhnev was in power, somebody asked if she'd speak out on behalf of the refuseniks. These are Jewish political prisoners, people, they weren't allowed to practice their faith openly in Russia. They wanted to leave the country so that they could live as Jews. A lot of them were held in prison. It was a dreadful business. When someone asked if she would speak out for these political prisoners, she responded to say that such people were Zionist fascists and opponents of socialism, and she would urge the Soviets to keep them in prison. They're not that keen on helping all political prisoners. She was a great fan of the East German leader Erich Honecker, under whose rule, of course, the Stasi locked up an awful lot of people. Again, they were not communists, so these weren't the kind of political prisoners in whom she was interested. The thumbnail for this video at the beginning shows Angela Davis being very pally with Erich Honecker, who actually gave her a medal. I mention all this to show that where racism is concerned, a completely different set of rules are applied to any other field. It's quite permissible to complain of some scientists being right-wing, but at the same time you can quote the most dreadful people approvingly, as long as their ideas are acceptable on race. The idea of listening to anything Angela Davis has to say on race and equality is utterly astounding, and that alone makes Rutherford's book valueless to me. I don't know, the tricks these anti-racists get up to.